Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's amazing. Thanks, Anita. So thank you so much for joining today's Action Masterclass. It's wonderful to have you all here. For those who may not know me, my name is Danny, and I'm the marketing exec for GTA Black Women in Tech. And this session is very kindly brought to you in partnership with Udemy, which is a platform committed to lifelong learning and empowerment. And today's session will be led by the incredible Gracious Nyamupachitu, who brings a wealth of expertise and knowledge. But before I hand over to Gracious, it's my pleasure to introduce someone equally as inspiring, and that is Madhvi Basin, which is the VP Global People Partners and Belonging, Equity and Diversity Inclusion at Udemy. And Madhvi is a true advocate for creating equitable workplaces, and we're honored to have her here to share a few words. So please join me in welcoming Madhvi.
Cool. Thank you so much, Danny. Hello, everyone. As Danny said, my name is Madhvi Basin, she, her pronouns. I am at Udemy and I lead our Betty efforts, which is belonging, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And super excited. I was telling when we were backstage, Gracious, I'm so excited to learn uh, for a couple of reasons. One, as Danny said, Udemy is an organization committed to lifelong learning. We definitely believe in the growth mindset, and especially with the Betty perspective. We were just talking, we had another session right before this. Like, there is always so much to learn around Betty. It's such an evolving field that it's important for us to learn from other experts and also people who have had different lived experiences. So I am super excited to be part of this. And I also want to call out the Black Women in Tech. This partnership has been very important for Udemy. We are always excited to have these partnership opportunities and especially this learning opportunity put together. For us at Udemy, I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about why is this important. And we were having this conversation a little bit earlier. For Udemy, the point is that we are creating a level playing field where you can have access to different kinds of skills and opportunities that you might not have in a traditional setup. So Udemy plays a very critical role in opening up the doors or bringing down the barriers to access to opportunity for learning. And learning is one crucial way where you can build more opportunities for economic mobility, for showcasing your talent, for thriving and moving forward. So for us, Betty is important not just internally because we want to grow that diversity and drive that innovation within our organization, but it's very important for us as a mission and as something that we contribute to the community. And that is why I think for us this partnership and especially this learning opportunity is super important because it takes forward the idea of like when you have access to learning and access to different kinds of viewpoints, you become a better organization. You can challenge the status quo. You become more innovative. So that's the piece that I'm super excited about and looking forward to learning. And with that, I will hand it back to Danny. But we at Udemy, we also have a watch party going on here, so we are all excited. And we'll be monitoring the chat. So if you have any specific questions about Udemy or our very strategy and philosophy, we can answer that in the chat as well. And Danny, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Madhvi, and thank you for those words. And a massive thank you to Udemy as well. Whether you've joined us in person at their events in Ireland or you're joining us today, it's been an incredible partnership. So yeah, I can't wait to do a couple more. So now I'll just pop Madhvi back here. It's my pleasure to introduce Gracious, who will be leading our session. And I'm handing over to you, Gracious. The floor's all yours.
Perfect. Thank you, Danny. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this masterclass on breaking barriers. The focus of this masterclass is going to be twofold. It's going to be on upskilling, which is a solution to breaking barriers. And it's also going to be about empowering underrepresented groups. And I'll go into the definitions a little bit about what I mean there. But before we get started, I just want you to know who you're talking to, right? Who am I and why am I the one running this masterclass? So I consider myself a lifelong learner. I think acquiring new knowledge and letting go of outdated practices or ways of thinking or mindsets has always been the cornerstone of my career story. And I've put some highlights on the screen as to what that means. So I am a Black woman in tech and I'm a global strategy and operations lead. So we can imagine some of the challenges that has come with and the amount of upskilling I've needed to do there. But ultimately, I've also run DEI programs across the tech industry, which is one of my biggest passions. And then I'm a founder and an individual business owner. And so learning to run your own business is really tough. And the last thing, which I'm actually really proud of as well, is having transitioned from the banking industry to the tech industry, and also moved from Zimbabwe to Ireland. So in all of that, there's been a lot of learning, a lot of unlearning, and I think there's a lot that I can share from my experience, from my research, and from that expertise. A little bit of housekeeping. This masterclass is supposed to be a toolkit that's filled with context and ideas to help you take action. What this masterclass is not is any official consulting advice or anything on behalf of any of my employers. So for those of you who connect with me on LinkedIn afterwards, just please remember that. Okay, so what are we going to cover today? As I mentioned, there's two key areas: inclusion, so empowering underrepresented groups, and then upskilling as a solution towards doing that. Here are the 4 topics that I hope to cover in the next 50 minutes. And the first is really the facts and figures. This is important because we have over 100 of you on the call. Thank you so much for registering. But this is only powerful if we all come from the same understanding and level of context. In the Breaking Barriers section, I actually want to do this by showing you what the barriers look like and what the impact of them in the job market are. And also what the opposite of that could look like, so that you can really paint a picture of what a success measure of this masterclass would be. The third bit is the really chunky part. Bring out the notepads. We're going to be talking about some skills and some upskilling solutions. There are many ways to break barriers, but we've landed on upskilling not only because in partnership with Udemy, it makes so much sense, but honestly, because as an all-round solution, it is a unique solution that ensures it can be done by individuals and it can be done by companies. So individuals can learn and unlearn, and that can help you grow in your careers. But similarly, companies can focus on learning, can focus on making sure they're creating environments for that unlearning so that people who are upskilling can thrive in those companies. So it's this twofold solution of upskilling that makes it such a powerful thing to really dive into and not just think, oh, does that mean I need to get a certification? No, it's a bigger topic than that. And then finally, we're going to follow through. So this is the thread I'm trying to weave. And I do see some chitter chatter in the chat, but please remember, I cannot see any of you. So I'm going to need you to let me know you're here, send me an emoji, anything. Tell me you commit to sticking with me through all 4 of these, so that it can actually be a meaningful through line and you can understand how 1 to 4 fully connect. Okay, let's start at the very beginning. What do we mean when we say underrepresented groups? People often default to saying the language diverse groups, but ultimately, if a group is diverse, it means that everyone is represented, including those who are typically part of the majority, right? So underrepresented is very specific as a term, because we're looking at the fact that statistically or by merit, we should have more representation, but we don't. So what is happening here? And I'll dig into some of those challenges in a little bit, but it's important that we call the groups underrepresented and not just diverse or not just minority. I've got some examples of underrepresented groups here, and particularly focusing on the tech industry, but also on UK and Ireland, just given the number of registrants from these markets. But of course, you can always research what that looks like in your individual market. Now, to get some chat going, I've intentionally left out some other groups from this slide. And I did that so that I could ensure that some of you will engage and give me some examples of other groups that I don't have listed here. And if you don't mention them, you keep them underrepresented even in this presentation, folks. So please do give some other examples of groups that are typically underrepresented in our industry. I think it's important to note as well that we live in a world where the more underrepresented you are, the less data there is around that underrepresentation, which makes it even more of a challenge. But I've picked out some really great stats in this. And what I wanted to also share is that, and then there's intersectionality. So intersectionality is the concept that layered identities also layer the disadvantages or the advantages that people experience in the world. So for example, being a Black woman, you can experience racism because you're Black, and you can experience sexism because you're a woman. That is a completely different set of challenges that you navigate in the workplace versus, say, a Black man or a white woman. And so when you look at these groups on the left-hand side, you also need to consider, what about an immigrant woman with a disability? How do those things compound? And in the workplace, there's even statistics around that, right? So for example, the first stat I have there is around Black people making up 4% of the UK tech market. Black women only make up 0.7%. The underrepresentation there is stark. Ideally, they should make up 2%, right? If we assume that 50% male, 50% female in the world, right? So you can see statistically how that intersectionality starts to come to play. Then we talk about systemic barriers. I absolutely love this image because these people are on the same ladder. They look about the same average height, but it's the tree. The tree is leaning a certain way. And so we need to talk about the tree, right? And what does the tree represent in our tech industry here, or in our job market more generally? When we say that something is a systemic barrier, it means that it's actually embedded within the structures, policies, and cultural norms of society. We don't really think twice. I'll give you an example of a job market systemic barrier. Sometimes you see a job description that says, need someone who speaks English at a native level. I don't know how many of us recognize what's wrong with that. Ultimately, while language proficiency may be necessary for the job, using the word native is exclusionary and can discourage applicants who are very proficient in English, but are not native English speakers, like myself, right? Another example is using language like chairman versus chairperson. I'm so glad that this is not something that I see as often, but depending on where you are and what sort of industry you're in, you still see that. And the issue with that there is using the word chairman evokes male dominance in leadership. It's so embedded, we don't even think about it twice. But that small shift can immediately change some of these things that disproportionately disadvantage other people. I also want to talk about that disproportionately disadvantaged piece, because one of the biggest challenges in some of these barriers, another example would be, say, if a job posting says, we need applicants from a top tier university, or say with big tech experience, you realize that we already have these people underrepresented in those spaces. So you're talking about the 4% in the UK that are working in the tech industry, and you only want from those 4%, that only compounds these barriers. So why are they there? Why do they still exist? I'm pretty sure so many of you are on this call like, yeah, we know that this is the problem, right? Now, the problem is historical inequities, unconscious bias, policy gaps, resistance to change. But I'm excited because can all of these 4 things be learned and unlearned? Absolutely. And that's why we're here talking about upskilling. Now, let's talk about what the challenges that are presented when you are underrepresented, and then there's these systemic barriers in the job market. Because I think this is what will really paint the picture for you of what the impact is in terms of why you might not be seeing underrepresented people on your teams, or as some of your applicants. I've often heard, people in people teams say, well, they don't apply. Well, let's talk about what it means and why people are not applying. Some of the ones are obvious, and we're about to play a game here. So please pull up the chat, but I call these the more obvious ones. But what I mean by that is honestly that they're more well-known. And the goal of this masterclass is to empower you with the tools to overcome these challenges. So what this section does is it primes you to think about, what skills do I need to learn or unlearn in order to overcome the challenge of pay inequality, the challenge of the only experience. Do you get where I'm going with this? And when you look at the challenges, which I think is really important to do, you also recognize how it continues to feed into the cycle. So pay inequality, income gap stifles wealth accumulation and opportunities. That also stifles who's going to go to that big university that you need in order to apply to get into tech, right? Or things like performance review bias. So Black employees are 40% more likely to get vague feedback. I'm going to pause, by the way. At the bottom of each one of my slides, you can see just the sources of these stats. Most of this data is between 2022 to 2024, unless stated otherwise. But if you want to dig in just to get an understanding, I just don't want to waste so much time telling you who said what. But trust me, I've done the research. But yes, so going back then to performance review bias. Now, the issue with not getting feedback is you don't know what you're doing right or wrong. You don't know how to get better. It hinders your promotion and professional development. And now we wonder why we don't have Black people in senior levels of the organization, right? So let's talk about the ones that I feel are not so obvious. The first would be coded language in job ads. So terms like rock star or culture fit, which are typically understood by the in-group that understand what that means. Can anyone share in the chat what they think is the impact of that challenge to the actual job market and to underrepresentation? Or if you have any ideas for any of the other ones, I'll talk through them to give everyone a moment. The second was access to networks. Did you know that only 24%, and I think this is Brookings Institution or Catalyst, only 24% of Black professionals have mentors or sponsors? What is the challenge of that, right? Emotional tax. 58% of Black tech workers feel they must outperform their peers. I know I felt that way. And the last one, representation in emerging tech. I love this one. And it wasn't even something that I would have thought of before researching for this presentation. But representation in emerging tech is so important because the tech industry will just continue to build upon the biases of today at the accelerated rate of something like AI, right? So when we only have Black professionals representing only 2.6% of AI specialists globally, like what is our ChatGPT learning? And what are the models that it is learning based on? I love some bits in the chat. We're creating a culture, but we're excluded from that dominant culture. Absolutely. Thank you, Mary. And access to networks being a big hindrance. So I've got these answers here for you. When you have coded language in job ads, there's a selection bias of the in-group participants. Someone who doesn't quite understand what rockstar means isn't going to apply for a job that needs a rockstar. Similarly, without the mentorship and networks and sponsorships in the rooms that underrepresented people are not in, people are not talking about them. And yet we know that those are the rooms where decisions are made. Emotional tax leads to burnout or leaving to entrepreneurship. There's so many articles that Black women are the fastest rising group, demographic of entrepreneurs in 2024. Another one is the current underrepresentation trends will compound. It looks like I gave you guys the answer there when it comes to the not so obvious about challenges. But I need everyone to walk away from this masterclass with hope and excitement and not doom and gloom. So what does the opposite look like? It does exist. For a lot of people, it does. So what does it look like? And how can we get more people to experience those job market benefits? Here's the opposite. So we had the only experience as the challenge. Now we have representation in numbers. We have no access to networks. Now we have access to networks. We have fewer microaggressions, job descriptions that just click for everyone. We have less identity-based emotional tax. Everyone has emotional tax, but when it's identity-based, it's an additional layer. You can't do anything about your identity most of the time. Pay equality and wealth accumulation, emerging tech inclusion, media representation, so you can see people that look like you where you're going. These are some of the job market benefits that we want to extend to everyone, not just to the select few. And here are some of the impacts of the benefits, which I won't get into too much, but I love the access to networks one because according to LinkedIn in 2023, 70% of jobs are filled through networking. I think I resonate with that. I've spoken to a lot of job seekers who are like, I've applied to 100 jobs and nothing's happened. And yet people who've spoken to 15 people and something has happened, right? So let's talk about how we go from that first image to the second image. How do we go from people being underrepresented and held back by the challenges due to systemic barriers to being people who are still underrepresented because that's a bigger feat, but they're now thriving, right? We are now thriving in organizations that are minimizing the challenges of systemic barriers. There's two parts to that. The individuals are thriving and the organizations are minimizing the challenges. Here's how we close the gap. And let me take a moment to just say why that matters, right? Because with this wide gap, economic inequality, which is what we all understand and know, right? So fewer opportunities for wealth creation, professional growth. But then there's things that actually really impact the company. So talent gaps, lots of missed potential in industries, particularly in tech, when you don't have that diversity of thought. Innovation loss. Diversity leads to innovation. When people have different ideas, that's when they can be competitive. And so you need to think of this from a business perspective, if anything, and recognize the importance of actually closing the gap. Enter upskilling, right? So closing the gap with upskilling. And here I've just got bits of the definition that I really love. Upskilling is about learning and unlearning, teaching. I don't want to use the word education, although that's probably what comes to mind all the time. But education sometimes feels like it's a little bit more formalized. And when I get into this bit where I'm hoping people are taking notes, I'll show you how maybe 2 of those things, 2 or 3 out of 9 that I'm going to share are actually maybe what is most considered education. Whereas learning and unlearning, and I love that Madhvi mentioned, the opportunity to have so many types of learning opportunities. So upskilling is more encompassing. So going to the learning, it's about new competencies, tools, methods. What do I need that's going to help me get further? But unlearning is also about what do I need to let go that's also going to help me get further as an individual or as an organization. And it benefits both, so that individuals are benefiting, but also company innovation, competitiveness, and culture are going better. Now, I really wanted to put this in here because you need to think about your learning investment to learning outcome ratio on a lot of things, right? Certain types of upskilling opportunities are time consuming, they're expensive, there might be a point in time and then you can't do it again for another 3 years or whatever the case is. So it's not always a one size fits all approach, depending on what it is you're looking for or trying to do. So let's talk about some of these examples, right? The first one is, there we go, certifications and credentials, right? So this is probably what comes to mind for everyone. It's degrees. Now, this is not me saying this is not important, but this is me saying there's another 8 areas that we could probably look into and a lot more that could be helpful, because how many people do we know with all these certifications and degrees and are still struggling to find the role that they're looking for in the job market? So the first one I want to talk about is mentorship-driven upskilling. I have personally benefited immensely from this. And I think it particularly helps with what is typically called soft skills, or better termed interpersonal skills. This is learned. It's actually quite difficult to learn this on paper. You need to learn this in theory in the field. Have a bad conversation with your boss. Have a moment where you have to give feedback to a colleague on a project. You kind of have to learn it in the moment. But I think what really sets you apart is that ability to go through it and then taking time to reflect with a mentor. Mentors are like your therapist for work. People might argue that's coaches, but mentors are like your therapist for work, right? Because you go there and you're heated up about how you're seeing this situation. And then you talk it through with someone with a little bit more perspective. And you find yourself learning something new about how to approach that situation in future. Personal branding. This was critically important. It's something you learn. It's actually not easy to articulate your strengths or to tie those strengths to a skill that is in demand. That is something you learn. There's courses on that. There's coaches on that. There's programs on that. There's all sorts of ways that you can learn how to do better personal branding. Leadership and resilience training. A lot of people say that the term, natural born leader, and I believe that is true. But that also typically works in an environment where people want to be led, or in an environment where people already like you, and so your charisma kind of works. We work in the tech industry. A lot of people don't want to be led, and a lot of people are probably don't want to be led by you, especially if you're from an underrepresented group. So there's a lot of training that you need to do and can do to learn how to be a leader in this environment, and also to learn to be a resilient leader in this environment. So get knocked down and come back up. The next is peer-focused training. I love that this is on here. It's in the center of my page because this is a very example of it, right? So GTA Black Women in Tech has brought us together today. I have learned so much from this peer network, and I imagine so many of you can say the same. It's just a matter of coming into this space and learning from other Black women who are navigating the industry with me, right? So if you are a GTA Black Women in Tech member, if you can drop a heart in the chat, if you've learned anything from this platform, please do. But ultimately, this is what peer-focused training would be. The next is job search strategies. Yeah, this one is like really critical because it's ever evolving, right? So I cannot tell you the number of senior level professionals that struggle because they haven't learned to job search in 2024 versus in 2022. Immediately, things have changed, right? The next one is data-driven skills assessments. You often see these on things like your interview panels, but you can also take them outside on your own, just something that proves, hey, I took a test and I know about 80% of these things pretty solidly, pretty well. Specialized training can close that gap when it comes to emerging technology. So you kind of go in a bunker and you learn about quantum computing or AI. And yes, there's LinkedIn learning, but there's value in learning to become a specialist in what you're doing. And that's what that is about. And finally, entrepreneurial training. I think a bunch of entrepreneurs in the chat or on the line can tell you there's a lot to be learned, and using all of these in combination, but also focusing on learning from other entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial focused programs can really help you thrive. So let's connect the dots. I've got these exact 9 on the left-hand side of the slide. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, I've got some of those challenges that we looked at earlier, right? So the challenges like having the only experience in work, or experiencing microaggressions at work, or maybe not having access to networks at work. What I wanted us to do here is to connect the dots, right? So what sort of upskilling solution in the beautiful colors can actually help you help you overcome the challenge on the right-hand side. So I'll go with some, but if anyone wants to put in the chat what they think for some of them. So I think the very first one on the only experience, peer-focused training, right? If you feel like you're the only Black person in your company and you do not know how to navigate that, look for a Black-led or initiative or training program or focused organization like Black Women in Tech, where you can find ways to learn among people like you. Another one would be diversity hire label, right? A lot of people are like, oh, she's only here because she is. I think a good one for that is either data-driven skills assessments or certifications. Prove them wrong with what you have. Sorry, Selene, I see your note there. Okay, if I can get people to thumbs up if they can still hear me, that would help. I just saw Selene's note saying, let's give it a minute. Okay, Danny, I have a thumbs up. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. If anyone cannot hear, just put it in the chat, but I just saw Selene's note there, so I thought you had lost me. But hopefully you haven't, and you're all still here. Okay, all the thumbs up are coming. I love this. Great. So what we're doing here is we're connecting the dots between the upskilling solution and the challenges that we identified, right? So I had talked about the only experience being potentially solved by peer-focused training, or diversity hire label, certifications and credentials, or data-driven skills assessments that actually prove, no, I'm not. Here are all my qualifications as well. Representation in emerging tech, specialized training, underfunding of Black founders, entrepreneurial training, personal branding, right? This is how you then connect the challenge you're experiencing to what type of upskilling solution makes sense. And this goes back to when I said, think about the investment to outcome ratio. Sometimes if the challenge that you're experiencing is around lack of credit for innovation, we might think, okay, well, I need to leave this industry completely. I need to go back to school. I need to learn a whole new thing, and I need to now become an engineer, right? Or maybe it's, I need to really lean into a personal branding program and understand how I can actually communicate my value better in this space and own the credit for myself, right? I'm not putting it all on you. I promise I'll get to the companies and the environments in a second, but it's important for us to recognize what we can do as well. All right, let's keep moving. So let's get practical here. This is literally this, the same upskilling solution, and what are the practical actions people can take. I like to do this because people might be like, okay, well, I get it. I need to learn about job search strategies, but where do I begin? So this slide here was so that you could actually put to paper something that you can do straight after this masterclass. And I'll share from my own personal experience. So when I was moving from the banking industry to the tech industry, I did not know that I wanted to do strategy and operations. I did know that I wanted to be in the tech industry. And I also knew that I knew a couple of the things that I was good at. And I knew that I was great at running programs in banking, even though we didn't call them that. So that was another thing I had to learn, that just because the language is different in a different industry doesn't mean it's not the same actual work. And so you need to learn how to communicate that separately. So certifications, my personal example, I knew I wanted to ramp up on how programs are owned end to end, but I didn't have the time or the funding to pursue something like PMP, right? So I also wasn't sure if PMP would necessarily be what I needed for whatever the next role would be. And this was when I was still applying, not when I already had the job. So I decided to get a Scrum certification and to become a certified Scrum product owner who basically runs programs. It was a 2-day intensive class. I took 2 days off work for it, and I just hammered in, and I learned that. Another upskilling thing I did was job search strategies. So the first thing I did was I did ensure my CV was applicant tracking system optimized, and that is just basically the systems that companies use where when you press apply and the CV goes in, typically they have to, they're getting millions and millions of applications. There has to be a system or a technology there that they use to get that first pass on CVs. A lot of us don't realize that some of the flowery things or the flowery words or the way we've arranged our CV just doesn't get us through the door simply because it doesn't tie to the technology. So do that first. But ultimately, I doubled down on my LinkedIn network, on finding common ground with people in the organizations or in the roles that I wanted, and on reaching out to them cold. I would say, you went to NYU, so did I. You're a Black woman, so am I. You're from South Africa, my brother lived there. Whatever I could find to start a network, I would. And it was through that I got people who were telling me about ATS, or people who were like, oh, I'm happy to refer you, right? So this was me really understanding better job search strategies. And the last one, I got HubSpot certified, and that's a data-driven skills assessment thing that I thought would be really helpful because of the type of roles that I was looking at. So these are just some examples, and I'm talking over the slide there instead of giving you what each point in the slide has, because you can always come back to it. I think this will be available to everyone after today, but also so that you can understand from a personal perspective what that looked like for me. So we're going to play Connect the Dots again, and you were all so great at thumbs upping, but you're not great with my games, y'all. I'm going to need you to help me out here. But ultimately, on the left-hand side, we have some high demand skills in the tech industry, right? So I've split these into technical skills and interpersonal skills. And what I wanted us to do is to look at which upskilling solution is best to apply for which skill. And I've got the numbers there so that it's less typing for everyone. Maybe I should pause for awkward silence so everyone can type for a second. But ultimately, like, what do you think is helpful to do certifications and credentials for? You can't quite get a leadership certification and be considered a leader. That might not be the best. You can be, but it might not be the best way to truly learn, right? It might be an easy way to get a certification, but to truly learn and be better. For leadership, you might consider mentorship-driven upskilling, or you might consider leadership and resilience training. Or maybe when we look at cross-cultural competence, I love that one. It's very critical. So how can we learn cross-cultural competence? Again, might not be the easiest thing to get from a certification or a credential, but it might be helpful to be in a peer-focused training quite like this one, where I know there's a lot of allies on the call that aren't necessarily Black women in tech and are really excited to be here learning about cross-cultural competencies. And then another one, let's pick a couple that certifications and credentials can do. Please, I'm not speaking down on that. I'm just saying it's probably the most understood. And so it's the one I'm shying away from, because most people really get it when they get Y certifications and credentials. But ultimately, a lot of technical skills can be learned that way as well. Okay. So let's talk about upskilling in action for individuals. And we're nearly there. I have 13 minutes to get you to the finish line, and then we have an open Q&A. But ultimately, I wanted to give you a clear 6-step plan for how you can actually upskill intentionally, right? Because I think sometimes what we tend to do is we might get on a platform. Thank you, Sharon. I love that. Specialized training, data analysis, and visualization. Absolutely. So I love that. What I want to do with the 6-step process is, typically, sometimes we might get on a platform like a Udemy, and there's so much great content there. And so you just start learning everything. But if you want your learning to actually help, if you want to be able to look back after 6 months and be like, that's the course, or those 3 programs were the programs, or that's the mentorship session that helps me be where I am, you need to be a little bit more intentional on setting out what your upskilling plan is going to be. So the first is define your goal. Why do you actually want to learn the thing? It keeps you focused and it keeps it measurable. I've got the example there of, say you want to secure a data analyst role in 6 months. Simple goal, there you go. Then you choose your metric. So what I mean by that is, in order to secure a data analyst role in 6 months, what do I feel I need to learn? What are those things that I am going to do and upskill? What are those areas I'm going to upskill in? The point of choosing metrics is it ensures you're accountable to actually reaching something. How many of us have stopped 7 Udemy courses and never finished them? It's not good enough, right? So we need to be in a place where we're like, I'm going to do 3 because these 3 help me lead my goal, help me reach my goal, right? So ensuring accountability and identifying the gaps that you don't have. And it also makes you sit down and research for a second. Hang on, what do data analysts do and what do I need to learn? So choose your metrics, and I've got those examples there. A certification, for example, AWS or PMP, GitHub projects. And then you need to track your progress. It's not good enough to say, I know I want to learn this, and I know I want to do this, and I know I want to achieve this goal, and not actually seeing how you're doing towards that goal. Sometimes tracking your progress doesn't mean you have to finish something. Sometimes it means recognizing, I said I needed this in 6 months. Everything around my life doesn't allow for that. I need to adjust to 8 months. Or I'm actually learning this a lot quicker than I thought I would. I need to pare back to 2 months. That's what tracking is about. It's not about slapping yourself on the wrist for not doing something in the time you expected it to. But it does help you maintain momentum and gives you the visibility of where you are today versus where you are when you started. Then you need to leverage your results. I cannot tell you the number of people, me included, who have all this knowledge, these tidbits of knowledge of things that we've learned, and yet we don't actually bring those to be like, hey, how can I bring that to my job so I can get that promotion? Or how can I bring that onto my CV for my job interview in engineering, and yet it's actually about event management? You need to leverage the results of your upskilling and really employ them into how you brand yourself and where you talk about who you are. We're such a full package, and the job market these days doesn't just look for someone who knows one thing, because we're also aware that those needs are going to change tomorrow. So that adaptability, that versatility is something to be celebrated, and you need to make sure once you've done a course, leverage the results and put it somewhere that can bring you somewhere. The last one is measure. So actually make sure that the upskilling you have done is leading to some sort of impact. This is kind of tied to the leveraging results piece. But this goes back to, I know of people who might go back to school for a whole degree. I'm often asked this because I now work in strategy and operations for a marketing team. And people always say to me, did you go back to learn marketing? And I was like, no, and sometimes I pause because I'm like, should I have, I get that imposter syndrome moment, but then I'm like, no, I know I did X, Y, Z, upskilling things that got me prepared to come into this job. So going back to that investment over outcome ratio, make sure that you're measuring that the investment is actually resulting in the outcome. And finally, iterate and improve. You have to consistently improve your skills, keep them relevant, keep them adaptable to new industry needs. So going back to that initial example where someone wanted to secure a data analyst role in 6 months, they secure the role 1 year, 2 years later, they're now thinking, okay, I need to shift focus from just data analysis to maybe I need to be a software engineer, right? And then in software engineering, I actually want to focus on AI or ML engineering, right? So you can iterate, improve, and continue to upskill. The job is not the end goal, basically, is what I'm saying. The end goal is to consistently iterate and improve. So for those who are still with me from the beginning, right, we talked about underrepresented groups, we talked about systemic barriers, then we talked about the challenges presented by systemic barriers for underrepresented groups. We talked about what the opposite of that would look like and how to get to the opposite of that. And now we're talking about how upskilling is the solution to do so. What I've just covered is a roadmap and some practical steps for what individuals can do to upskill. But it takes two. How the people from minority groups and everyone, honestly, can upskill to thrive in the system, but then what companies and organizations can do to ensure that those of us who are out there upskilling can actually thrive in those organizations. So enter the section about companies. The blue bit is what I told individuals to do. The pink bit is what I'm hoping companies will do. And as I did in the previous example where we had a slide like this where we were getting practical, I'm going to share my personal experience on this one. Let's talk about peer-focused training. I really want to share about this because I'm truly proud of Pinterest for having a program that is called Bloom. And Bloom is a 2-3 day conference that brings together every Black employee across the company globally. And they are tailored learning sessions for the Black experience. No code switches, leave your emotional tax at home. You're coming here to learn among each other and for your growth, right? So that is an example of something that a company can do to help with peer-focused training. This is another example, Udemy partnering with Black women in tech. Another example I know is mentorship and sponsorship, right? So I've been in companies where leaders are actually graded on how involved they are in employee resource groups. For those who don't know what employee resource groups are, these are they're affinity groups where people from underrepresented communities come together to run programming or to change policies within the company, put on events, support one another. But ultimately, getting senior leaders to all commit to sponsoring an employee resource group, how that helps with mentorship and sponsorship is they are at the front lines watching underrepresented people do their best work. They are now able to say, hang on, no, I've seen her run a meeting. I know she can do that. Or, I've seen them put on an entire event for the entire company. I know they can do that. They're starting to talk about us in rooms that we are not in because they're committed to being ERG sponsors. So those are some of the examples of what organizations can do. And again, not talking over this slide because I appreciate, you will get these slides afterwards. So I don't want to state what's just on the slide. Okay. Now we're going to talk about this web. And I did this intentionally because I think for companies, just getting the L&D platform up and running and being like, off you go figure out some things that you're doing internally is not good enough. there are a lot of areas that promote upskilling that need to work in tandem in order for it to be an environment that is inclusive for people's career development. Performance review equity. For example, are companies using structured reviews with clear criteria to reduce bias? It's not good enough to be like, just write a self-review. It has no word limit. It has no goals behind it or no OKRs behind it. Makes it very difficult for someone who might be better at writing about themselves and someone who's not to actually be reviewed equitably. Employee resource groups, I just spoke about those. Accessible workspaces, ensuring that physical and digital spaces are inclusive and accessible for all employees. Sometimes people literally forget that digital accessibility is a thing, right down to the color of your brand and the hue of the color of your brand can be more accessible. Inclusive hiring practices. So using structured interviews, having diverse hiring panels. For so many people on this call, this might seem obvious, and I'm impressed by that and actually inspired by that, because a lot of companies are doing better. But for some people on this call, they might be like, oh yeah, duh. And I'm like, yeah, some of these are pretty low hanging fruit, right? Sponsorship programs, mentorship programs. Now, I know someone asked that question earlier, and thank you. I think Sunita answered, what is the difference between sponsorship and mentorship, right? And ultimately, and just in case anyone else didn't see it on the chat, and I don't know if this is exactly how Sunita described it, but how I like to think about it is sponsorship is someone who is in a line of influence that can actually impact your career, and they need not have a direct personal relationship with you. They just need to be aware of what you can do and be in a position of influence where they can speak to it and advocate for you. A mentor has a direct personal relationship with you. They know what you're going through in the workplace, and they're interested and excited about your growth, but they're not tied to you staying in that specific company or doing, the next thing that you told your manager you were going to do. They're focused on your career growth. Both of those people are very, very important. And programs that ensure that people have access to those people are also equally important. I've got a couple of other ones there. Clear career pathways. A lot of people get to the job and then 5 years later are like, now what? Companies need to map out transparent pathways for promotions or growth, because if you're not doing that, what's happening is those embedded systemic barriers, those are what's driving career pathways in the company. Diverse supplier programs. I absolutely love that one, where companies go beyond their employees and they partner with diverse vendors, so women-owned businesses, Black-owned businesses. What does that do, and what's the impact of that? It's not just about doing good. It's about providing access to the industry to people who are underrepresented. So that people who are, it might even just be the supplier, your caterer, that starts to recognize, okay, this company cares. What does working in this industry look like, right? Because a lot more diversity is just around me. And then there's a couple of other ones on there that you can all come back to and look at. Now, I really want to hone in on this part, and this is in action for employees. So for individuals, I gave you 6 steps. Companies, here's 3 steps. The first is transparency. Sharing your metrics and goals publicly to build accountability. A lot of companies are now doing this. A lot of countries now do this around any goals to do with sustainability, inclusion, anything. But these are some of the stats you might want to look into, right? So workforce representation, the percentage of women in leadership roles or ethnic minorities in technical positions, tracking gender and ethnicity pay gaps, looking at whether underrepresented groups are promoted at the same rate as majority groups, or at least at comparable rates, right? These are some of the metrics that you really need to tie to the programs so that they have an impact. There's no point in spinning up a program and just saying you have it. It actually needs to do something, right? Intersectionality. I mentioned this before, and it was about the crossover of identities and the overlap of identities and what unique challenges that presents. It's important for companies to analyze data across multiple identities to make sure that everyone is captured. Half inclusion is not inclusion, right? So monitoring things like turnover rates to be like, why do we keep losing these people? Analyzing if there are barriers that are discouraging some people from participating or even accepting offers. Questions like, do you feel your opinions are valued? Putting something like that in an employee voice survey and really getting to hear what people are saying. And then the last one is continuous improvement. So to regularly revisit the metric, see where you are. I think companies are so loud when we meet the goal 5 years early. But how loud are we when we're not meeting the goal on time and we need to change a couple of things internally? And also, are we comparing to one another, right? Industry leading companies, are you comparing board diversity to industry benchmarks or to your peers? Tracking your inclusion in things like success planning. So if you've hit the goal this year 5 years early, are you going to maintain that goal based on your succession planning? And then, another example is tracking the percentage of procurement spend on businesses owned by women or minorities or disabled individuals. That goes back to that example I gave about having diverse suppliers, for example. So these are the 3 steps for companies: transparency, intersectional lens, and continuously improving. So here are the key takeaways. For individuals, upskilling is your superpower. Focus on your high demand skills, technical and interpersonal, strategic networking, and then continuous learning. Remember to track your progress and to measure the outcomes and leverage every achievement to make meaningful progress on your career goals. For companies, upskilling is the cornerstone of building future-ready workplaces. Think about it from a business perspective first. Invest in tailored training and support programs. Know that different people, underrepresented people, need different things. Inclusive work environments, that does not leave out well-represented people. By the way, this is not an attack on, well, the majority gets this. No, we want everyone to get that, including the majority, right? So inclusive work environments. And then data-backed impact of initiatives. Not good enough to just spin it up and say, well, it's there. What is it doing? This strengthens the workforce, but as I said, it also drives innovation and drives productivity in your company. And then for everyone on this masterclass, regardless of who you're representing, where you stand, student all the way to, board chief executive, as you leave this masterclass, ask yourself, what upskilling solutions can I implement today to future-proof my career? And then ask yourselves, how can I support others in their upskilling journey? Perfect. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I saw a lot of chitter chatter. Thank you for all answering each other's questions and for connecting. I saw 2 people in biotech talking. I appreciate you all sticking with me through this. And then, of course, connect with me on LinkedIn, Gracious Nyamupachitu. And I'm really interested to hear your feedback. So if you were here today, I know that there will be a survey going out, but also if you want to LinkedIn me personally and let me know anything that stuck with you, anything that I could improve, I'd absolutely appreciate that.